So as people are coming in, trickling in from wherever they are, probably from another meeting, as we all do, I wanted to take a moment and just give you all a heads up as to the next OpenChain mini summit coming up. It's going to be in just a couple weeks on June 14th. So that truly is just a couple weeks away, just a few weeks away. And it is at, starts at, I have to do the mental translation of time zones, 2 p.m. UTC. It's going to be another 3-hour mini summit. And we are looking at an agenda that will include 1 hour of a newbie session, 1 hour of specification security guidance documents, 1 hour of additional work on the education course. So I wanted to make sure that you all are aware of that. It is on the global calendar, so you can find that. But I just wanted to make sure that I took a moment to just highlight that's existence coming up. And as always, if anyone has any trouble with the global calendar, please feel free to drop me an email and I'll see if I can help.
So Jenny, just remind me, if you subscribe to the global calendar, that should automatically have appeared in people's diaries, presumably.
One would hope. I know we all have trouble getting all the calendars to work across projects, so it's always a hope.
What day did you say was the
14th at 2 p.m. UTC.
That's interesting. I don't see it on mine.
Let me see if I can send it out. Let's see. I'm going to send it out to the main list and we'll see if that populates for folks. Yes. Okay, so for anyone that didn't automatically appear for, that should now show up with an invite in your email.
Thank you. So just traveling through the ether.
Shane also wanted me to just make sure that I highlighted, we've got some supplier education pack translations always ongoing, right? Just to make sure that everyone is aware of the location of where those can be found. And, you know, so for those of you that don't know, those are available on OpenChain GitHub, as is most everything. And so if you are ever looking for it, I think that this, yeah, so this is where you're going to find these. And the most recent one added was 6 hours ago, and that is the Korean one, which Shane also sent a little email out about to get some feedback on if anyone has any feedback about that. But just wanted to make sure that we highlighted that as well for everyone. So this is my first of these meetings that I've attended. What all are you working on right now? I know the education course is a constant process. What all is at the top or the forefront at the moment?
So I think what we have done is we cover a number of topics. I often will touch on the spec for some period of the meeting. Education is clearly one of the other topics, but there are other, I guess, working groups. I'm not familiar with which one's more ready to discuss today, other than the spec piece that I work on.
Since you chimed in, I feel like you should probably go ahead and keep us updated.
Sure.
I mean, we haven't been covering all three. I think I certainly don't remember the last time we've covered all three aspects. I think we have certainly been running out of time sort of discussing one or two of the sort of working group areas.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Well, I will sit back and take any notes, and I'm just here for support.
Okay. So I'll jump in and I'll cover. I usually try to allocate roughly 20 minutes of spec stuff, because I'm assuming it's time shared with others, but we'll see how far that goes. I'll pop up some slides here. Okay. Can you see my slide deck? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So let me go full screen on that. Let me just, usually I like to start off, if anybody has any immediate comments about the current spec. There's always multiple ways of people to communicate feedback, but it's always good to have this brief moment to communicate during this meeting. Then I thought I would continue on with, we discussed how we're going to look at discussing and how to rearrange the spec a little bit to where we're going to pull out community engagement. I'll talk about that a little bit more, and hopefully we can start that discussion a little more in more depth today. And then there's that idea of having this optional security reference guide, which will eventually potentially evolve into another extension of the spec. So with that, I'll go to our first item on the agenda. Again, as I mentioned, there's always other opportunities to provide feedback to the spec. It could be done through our the GitHub issues list. It could be done through the email list, but also this meeting. Has anybody been working on the spec and they've come across something that they find, worth discussing? Possibly trying to fix something that they find that might be a little awkward. I'll pause for a moment.
Gautam here. Again, we are in the same position. I thought of asking these questions to all the members here, like, because we are trying to work on this specification 2.1 and get to the conformance of this like 2.1. So I guess some of the members here might have got the conformance, and even I'm also expecting the same kind of inputs for the three questions. Yeah.
So are you working on getting towards conformance right now with the 2.1?
Yes. So basically, it's like we are in first step. We haven't gone through much actually. So yes. So we are
Okay.
trying to work on this spec. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe it's too early to ask, but at first glance, do you see? Is there anything that you find that might be a little confusing, or you think might be a little challenging to implement, or?
I don't think that it's a challenging thing, because the specification 2.1 questionnaires is like very clear and easy to understand. But the concern or the confusion here is like, what is the level that we need to satisfy for each questionnaire to get the conformance? So that's what the kind of confusion or the questions we have. So basically, in terms of the responsibilities creation and the responsibilities assigning to the current roles or the existing roles in order to cover, that is one part of the specification. The other part is like FOSS policy, right? So it's like we have things are in place, like which is completed 100%, and some part which is still in progress. That means, like for example, if you take FOSS policy, It is like a kind of approval level in the executive board actually. So it's not yet approved, but we have a draft ready, and we have gone through all the legal aspects of this POS policy, and all the legal and the compliance team legal, everyone agreed to that. Okay. We are still waiting for the approval. Is this the stage is fine in order to answer the question whether do you have a defined POS policy? I can say yes, it's a draft, right? I can mention it's a draft. So can I go for conformance? That is what my kind of question I have. And in terms of responsibility assignment, is it required that we should have each and every roles defined, and it should have any one-to-one mapping to the people in the organization, or it can be an additional responsibility for the people who is interested to work on this specification with the team which is trying to get the conformance on the open chain. So that is the kind of questions I have.
Okay, so as far as feedback on the spec, you think some of this is not clear on how to complete the evidence for it. Each item is what you're suggesting. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, Mark, I was just going to say, I think you know that the spec does have quite a lot of flexibility, and I guess what most people who are not very familiar with the spec and come from a sort of a new to trying to do the conformance, it is very difficult to assess what does this mean in practice. I personally, and you know that I'm a great fan of people sharing what they have done. So perhaps what we need to think is sort of inviting 2-3 companies who are conformant to actually come and sort of showcase what they have done and how they've achieved. And I have to say, you know, when I did the 2.0 conformance, I did the same thing as what we did last time round, where we looked at the items one by one and ranked where we are and what is missing. Literally in the Word document, sort of, so that we can sort of go and this is still red or this needs work, and then sort of close those actions by saying, okay, now we've updated our external facing policy, for example, or now we have a table that lists the individual responsibilities across the organization. So those are probably the practical aspects of how to interpret the spec is probably people will find it incredibly useful, because there is flexibility, and you know, I think from the onset we said we have to leave that level of flexibility because organizations differ in size, differ in where they sit in the supply chain. So it is important to have that degree of flexibility in the spec.
That's an excellent point worth emphasizing, and it's one of at the core of our design goals, right? Is we're not prescriptive. We provide the what and why, not the how and when, right? That's always an emphasis. And to your point, that means we want that ability for everybody to implement this based on their own organization and their customer demands, right? Yeah. So one of the guides I often recommend to people, if you look at this one particular requirement, documented policy exists pretty much, is to say, if you were audited by a customer, what would you show them to show evidence of this? The key is to have the evidence, to systematically go through, create the evidence, put it into some digital form, and assume that you will be audited by one of your customers. And one of your customers, any customer should be entitled to audit you with your permission, of course. That's between you and your customer.
And I totally agree with you, Mark. I mean, we have we have chosen to actually add the policy into our generic policies that every ARM employee has to sign up to, which they do once a year. So that there is clear evidence that if we're asked, we're able to demonstrate that the policy is here and everybody has accepted that policy across the organization. But I think those practical aspects are probably where people are sort of looking for some guidance. What is the best way? And maybe what we have done might not fit another organization, because you might not have a requirement for every employee to click and accept the policies, but you can find alternative ways. And I think sharing those experiences between different conformant companies will consolidate ideas for others how they can accomplish the same required.
Sure. No, I agree. And
Yeah,
so, go ahead.
yeah, sorry
So,
to interrupt.
question. Even though there is that flexibility of implementation in many different ways to implement a lot of these different things, and I like that idea of having people sign on the policy. That's a great idea. But the Gautam's specific question was, are we going to be conformant if we have a policy that is in draft form and not approved?
Well, my answer is a draft form is, well, here's the second requirement is a procedure exists for the participants to be aware of the existence of the policy, right? So a draft form, I don't think would generally meet that requirement. So I don't believe a draft form is sufficient based on what's stated here. But we should always discuss whether people have the same interpretation, right? So, and then I'm glad that this is brought up. We can look at the spec and someone's working through it and their experience. So yeah, I think that kind of states it's got to be more than a draft. And then the second question, I think, was around the roles and responsibilities. Okay, I'm scrolling down to I'm already past that. Let's see here. Go ahead.
In the spirit of full disclosure, Gautam and I work together on this in the same company. So one of the things we've talked about is the roles and responsibilities, because in the self-conformance questionnaire, there's a tab that lists roles and responsibilities. In our work environment or our automotive environment, people tend to take this stuff as required. But I think it's not, right? Because the spec itself just says to identify those that you need that affect the performance and effectiveness of the program, right? So you just need to figure out what works for your organization and then do that.
I think that's correct. I think it is very much about your organization. And the question I always ask is, if you had to present this through an audit to one of your customers, how would you want to articulate that or demonstrate the evidence of this, right? So there's flexibility here.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, it's interesting. We chose to do it at two levels, Mary. So for example, the non-compliance risk is assigned to our general counsel. So there is a company risk register, and non-compliance is registered against the sort of the GC as a risk that has to be managed. So you could argue that accountability at that level is sufficient, but we have chosen to, in addition to that, to sort of say individual programs must have somebody, if there is an issue, that person becomes responsible for ensuring any remedial action is taken by that individual. So we went into, and it could be generic. It could be, well, the head of the automotive group will that, and then they will filter that through. In our case, we actually designated somebody within engineering for each business group to do that, and also somebody from the legal department who generally addresses the business need for that business group. So we have actual individuals, and of course, if they move on, their replacements will take that responsibility.
Okay.
But I think there is a lot of flexibility, because you could argue that you know, is it sufficient to say actually this is recognized at a company level? It's the accountability of the legal counsel to ensure that that is, you know, whatever is required is met. And Mark is right. You have to think, if today a customer comes to you and says, well, demonstrate to me that you are, you know, you're managing this, actively managing this. Do you think you saying, well, actually it is assigned to my legal counsel or to my head of the business, is that sufficient? Or, you know your industry quite well, you know when you're audited, what potential customers might ask for in other areas, not necessarily in the compliance area. So you'd be able to gauge what level is sufficient for my organization.
Okay, but what I think the takeaway here is also some good feedback, by the way, Sammy. Thank you. I think the feedback here to the spec is possibly some use cases or examples of how companies record their evidence with respect to a given requirement. And maybe there's two levels. There's like, okay, there's some guiding principle, like, okay, how would your customer review the data you provided? And here's an example of how some companies do it, knowing that different organizations may have slightly different requirements around how to implement one of our spec requirements. Okay.
Yeah, Andrew here. So no, I mean, that's a really, really good point, Mark. And I think we're looking at it, one of the perspectives we're looking at it from is obviously the certification perspective. So from that point of view, I think we're always looking at outcomes. So is what you have in place, is it going to generate the outcome that needs to be generated? And with what level of confidence are the procedures and practices that you have in place, are they going to produce that outcome? So that's sort of basically what we're looking at fundamentally when we're doing a certification. And one of the things that I was talking to Shane about recently was the idea of maybe having some sort of virtual company case studies, which might make people feel slightly more comfortable to contribute, rather than sort of opening their all of their own internal procedures, warts and all. So we can have a sort of walkthrough for different business cases. And I was thinking about it in terms of the modes of distribution, whether, so for example, whether somebody's going to be distributing software that is going to be installed on a desktop, or distributing software which is part of an embedded device, or distributing software that's going to be going onto an app through an app store, for example, and using that to provide some examples as to what compliance might look like. But obviously we have to be very careful to make sure that then that doesn't become too prescriptive, and that every stage we make clear to people that this is very flexible. We're not telling you, how to do things. But I think that there may be some scope in developing some sort of virtual case studies like that.
So to your point, which is a really good one, about having different examples for different kinds of one size doesn't fit all, right? So here's several different kinds of sizes. I think that one of the things we always hoped with the spec is that people would come forward and do a lot of those best practice like articles. Like the spec itself is got to be neutral, non-prescriptive, but we hope and encourage people to write a blog or an article and say, oh, here's a best practice when implementing the spec, and here's how we do it. I understand that maybe the virtual art description is a good way. It's a good article that would be in that direction as well. So my hope is, my emphasis is, as well as to encourage best practices to be published. Again, we don't encourage any specific practice, but the collection of practices is definitely part of the value we're offering. Yeah. So if anybody wants to write an article, and you might even think about it as series of articles, like, all right, take the policy and talk about your experiences and how you ended up implementing it. And then you can go on to the training and write an article about that. It doesn't have to be all one massive article. So I'm just encouraging people to consider writing those kinds of things, or videoing or whatever. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, that's fine for this part of the feedback part of our of the spec talk today. Next thing I would like to do is remind people very briefly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we discussed it at length last time, that you know, what we view here is the specification is this core foundation, that we are really at the base. We assume you have to be license compliant before you could even use open source. Like that's the, you know, the ticket to get in the door. And in order to do that, you had to build a bill of materials. You know, creating this bill of materials, and ultimately, what we're on a mission to do is build trust around the use of open source within any given solution. Solutions are comprised of a mix of proprietary and open source. That's very typical, and we assume that's the case. It's not about all open source solutions. It's about this hybrid solution that any organization will put out, and that we want to make sure that when you pass that solution on to a recipient, that they can trust that you've handled all the open source well. At least in the first pass of the spec, you've done license compliance well. You're disciplined around that. And again, a bill of materials exists. That bill of materials is potentially input into other activities, such as the security management, security vulnerability management, because you have to systematically go through that bill of materials, right? And perform a certain set of analysis tasks and clearance tasks. You know, tentatively we put up this notion of malware protection, probably is a better word than prevention, recently been recommended. Export compliance is another area, right? And then another area that, you know, it's a little bit more distance off is functional safety. But what we want to do today is focus on security and community engagement. So what I'd like to highlight is that, you know, here, currently in our spec, community engagement is a major section of the spec. And what we're recommending to do is to pull it out of the spec and make it one of these optional pieces, because community engagement is kind of written in a kind of almost a conditional or optional way in the spec. The point we made last time is by pulling it out and using it as a good first test case or pilot to get this idea of an optional extension to the spec, work that out through something people are already, you know, kind of doing within the spec, but make it a little bit more beefier, right? Now that we pull it out, we don't. The problem with community engagement was a lot of companies may not be as mature in their community engagements when they're younger, but as companies get older, they tend to have you know, a more distinct role in contributing to the community. We feel that by pulling it out, one, if you're already conforming with the spec, it doesn't change it. It doesn't hurt you. It actually makes it a little easier to conform with the spec, right? Because it's no longer a base piece. And then the other thing is to work on the security. So what I try to do here is outline, if we had this breakout, this separate optional extension of the spec, right, called community engagement, what might be the sections that we would have there? We were limited to what we could do in that section because, again, we didn't want to force and assume everybody who was license compliant, you know, doing all the good things around license compliant, was also mature enough to handle all the community engagement stuff. But now we can make that assumption because it's an optional piece that they get to conform to and then put out on their website or convey to their customers. Or sometimes they just want to use it internally to say, do we have a decent program inside our company? And then go through this, when it comes to community engagement, are we doing all the right things? And so that it's a kind of like almost a guide. I'll jump quickly over to security for the same idea. We want to put together a set of sections in this optional piece as well, that again, you assume OpenChain conformance and that you're going to build on top of that. Okay, so that's the idea. We're almost developing these in parallel because, first of all, security has become a real important topic, right, for open source trust, trusting the open source. And also community engagement is one that we are very comfortable with. and that we believe can be they can go in parallel, but with community engagement being slightly ahead in this evolution of the spec. So I'm going to briefly pause for a second before we dive in to start talking about how we might organize the community engagement section. Any other thoughts or feedback or questions about this approach? Okay, so let me go this is only the first pass, right? This is laying out some kind of framework of how we're going to evolve this optional piece called community engagement. And simply what I've done is I put out the first item is it assumes you've achieved open chain conformance. That means you're really good with license compliance, right? That's at the base. Now, naturally, we have in the spec today, we have a request. Let's see if I can find the spec again. In this section, understanding community engagement, it's very simple. Right now, it says, if you do contribute, right, if an organization permits contributions, right, then you shall have a documented contribution policy. Procedures about the governance of these contributions exist, right, and then making this available awareness to everybody. That's all we really cover today. And again, our idea is to take this section, and I'm going to use the word a little, tear it out of the spec, so it's no longer there, but now make it much more detailed. Now we have the freedom to make this a little bit more beefier, okay? And so come back to the slide. And if you look at our spec, you're going to see very similar items. It's kind of like a repeating pattern, right? So we expect there will be a policy as we have today, in the thinner version in the spec, right? But now we're going to talk about, training and competence, right? This is really what we've done for training. There's some kind of training and awareness is about making sure that information is communicated effectively. We can look at how the spec is written today for license compliance. There's a notion of a program scope. People get to define within their own organization, maybe only a small little division of their company is doing community engagements. We don't expect the whole organization to be participating. They get to define the scope within their organization. And then access has to do a lot with outside communications and how you communicate outward within your organization. And then effectively resourced is about assigning roles and responsibilities. And then the last item is really what gets to be very domain specific, very detailed. And like, again, we would want to be too prescriptive, but we want to say, well, if you're doing security, in our case with license compliance, what we say, you have to iterate through the bill of materials and make sure you're complying with all the licenses. What we can say is you can iterate through the bill of materials because we assume they're open chain conforming. They have a bill of materials that you are ensuring that you're conducting proper scanning, or you have a check for each component in your list against the CVE database. Okay. Now, I mean, we really want to get to this last bullet item and go into detail. That's where the real interesting parts of this. I'm sorry, I was talking about security part when we talk about this part, but when it comes to community engagement, this would be more specific to what kind of processes or do you expect them to do when they're engaging with the community, right? So I'm gonna again ask: is anybody not comfortable with taking this approach of breaking out this new optional module or piece of the spec and taking this and outline and filling it out? Or are we missing a section?
I mean, Mark, I think to Andrew Katz's point earlier on, I think we need to think about what the outcome or what the output is, because that will actually determine what sections you need to do. So it's important to think, okay, so a conformant organization that is engaged with the community and contributes, what would you expect as an outcome? For example, I would expect that they would have clarity as to which projects they're contributing to. I would expect sort of that they adhere with the sort of obligations and the governance obligations of the project. So those are the things that in doing, you know, the policy and competence and awareness, that becomes an outcome. And it's important that we capture that in our thinking when we split this into a community engagement. And the same thing with security. What does that mean in practice when I know you haven't touched on the security yet, but in both cases, I think we need to think what do you expect if you follow this sort of part of the spec or this add-on to the spec.
I think it's a very good point. We should start with what's the output.
Yeah.
So this is an opportunity for us to begin to list that output. What's the output of a successfully run community engagement program? So we know in license compliance, the outcome is a set of compliance artifacts, right, that allow you to be compliant with that, all the open source in your software delivery, and they accompany your software delivery. So with the community engagement, what are some of the outputs you would expect? Like, I'm going to start writing out some stuff. Like, do you expect a list of projects that you contribute to?
I think would it help to look at it from the perspective of the audience, because all of the other specifications and suggested extensions, the audience is essentially going to be the customer. It's all part of the supply chain. It's people thinking, right, so do I have confidence that this organization is developing open source properly from a compliance perspective? Do I have confidence that they're taking sensible procedures as far as security is concerned? It's going to be slightly different with community engagement. I mean, that will be key, but only in certain circumstances. So it might be the case that, for example, I'm a customer for a particular organization that's producing open source around a particular framework. I don't know, Yocto or something, for example. So it may be that I'm quite keen for my supplier to engage with the Yocto community because I want to make sure that any of the development process that improves the underlying framework gets upstreamed. So that's the sort of thing I'd be interested in as a customer, but that's pretty specific. What would be much more interesting to me if I was a prospective employee and I found and I saw that the company was OpenChain compliant and also compliant with the community engagement extension, that would be of particular interest to me. So I think this is a great way of going through it, Mark, don't get me wrong, but I think just while we're doing that, it might be useful in the back of our minds to think about who the audience is in each of these individual cases.
I think that's an excellent point, to understand who is going to value the output, right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I think you're touching on that, because I'm not sure a lot of customers may per se are as interested in your community engagements. It doesn't mean they aren't, but it's more often for, like you said, for internal comfort or confidence that you're doing the right thing, like contributing to a certain organization. You want to have some kind of discipline and organization around your community engagement activities, right? And usually organizations, the companies themselves, this is value to them. Now, this original section came about because when we were putting together the original OpenChain spec, it was communicated that the community wanted some kind of something in the spec. They gave them, some assurance that companies that were, using open source were somehow also being educated or were aware enough about communicating, or contributing to the community. It was almost like it was a community request. And we put it in there because of that. It was like, that was the audience originally for that section. Now, that's another who, right? The community itself, they feel, but I'm not sure they're out there wondering or asking if a company is, OpenChain conforming, and or are they conforming to any kind of spec with respect to engagements.
It comes up more in acquisitions. If a company is being acquired, what is the nature of the engagement with the community, with the open source community? Because that sort of brings in other risks, whether it is from a patents perspective or it is from copyright perspective. But in the who, I also think today, if a company is conformant and is participating in a project, is it clear that the company or the organization understands its obligations in the nature of the engagement when collaborating on a project? Can somebody, let's say, I don't know, ARM is contributing to the Linux kernel. Do people know within the Linux community if there is an issue that they can contact somebody within ARM to raise any queries around certain contributions that ARM has made? That's thinking about the community itself, looking inwards into a company. Is it clear how they can engage with that company or organization?
So in some ways, you're touching on the third one is more about a community viewpoint of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay. So those are the who's that we have identified so far. And then we have to ask ourselves for each of those who, the audience members, what they want if you're successfully running a community engagement program within your organization, right? So I'm going to put over here some bullet items of what they would like to make sure is happening. So why would a company want to know that they're being disciplined enough around community engagement? I mean, what would they expect to have? I would think, I'll throw one out there as a minimum, that you'd have a list of projects that you guys have entered into an engagement with, and a list of the internal people who have been assigned to contribute to that project. And part of that is making sure that you've had the proper CLA in place, exactly, or the DCO, whatever, acknowledged, and that your organization has signed off on that, right? Because you have to make sure. Some organizations, you require a legal approval of the CLA signed, whatever.
What's the
CLA? The CLA is a contribution license agreement. So when you contribute to the organization, there's an assumption that there's something in place that says when you do give something to them, these are the terms in which you give it to them under. And sometimes they have some interesting or unfortunate, some challenging requirements, like you assign patent licenses to every contribution you make, things like that. That's a little extreme, but that typically exists.
Yeah. So one of the practical question would typically be, are people allowed to use their company email when they're signing up to contribute to a particular project, or are they not? Because that will be a question that will need to be sort of dealt with internally, and it may well be that there are company procedures just don't handle that. So that's something that would need to be considered.
So let's this is very much a kind of a thinking out loud initiative here. We're trying to brainstorm. So there's going to be a policy, and you're probably going to have about this is just a kind of a random list of, like, for example, emails used, company, right, versus personal.
Basically, it can be like contribution guidelines, right?
Say that again. Contribution what?
Contribution guidelines.
So what sort of guidelines are you thinking about?
Guidelines. Okay.
Yeah, guidelines.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that comes up there quite a bit is own time contribution versus company contributions.
Yeah. Yeah, and this actually a thing we have is a notion of what we refer to as own time. So how can I say this? Oftentimes there's an employment agreement in place, and it talks about what rights the company owns based on your job responsibilities, right? Most high-tech companies have those, and you can't get acquired by another company if you don't have these things in place, right? But there are times where developers want to work on stuff and they want to clear this separation from, they're working on something that's not necessarily under the employment agreement, but they need to get some kind of clarification from the company so they can remove any confusion about, things they do in their own time versus things they do for the company versus company.
Yeah, that makes sense. It could also be to do with level of involvement in terms of seniority, because it may be that the company is prepared to allow people to contribute in terms of just suggesting pull requests for bug fixes, for example, but they don't want them to have, full committer status, or they don't want them to get involved in sort of high-level management of the project. So there may need to be some sort of guidelines around that as well.
So there might be, again, this is more of brainstorming. There might be a per project policy document, or I'm not sure this might be too prescriptive. I'm not sure yet. Let's not worry about that, because eventually we'll come back and ask ourselves, I will challenge us on every item, whether it's too prescriptive. That's one of the things I need to do, be aware of. But I mean, do you have a per project policy or document that guides you? Because different projects, you're going to have different levels of involvement.
So we have the concept of a gatekeeper who is responsible for any approved contributions, where it's their responsibility to review and agree whether a contribution is sort of within the scope of what has been approved. And we refer to them as gatekeepers. And this is on a per project basis, basically.
Just a list of projects and who can contribute.
Yeah.
I mean, what we do, we actually, well, this is more of a prescriptive thing, but we have, anytime someone wants to contribute, we have a checklist, right? And we make sure that whatever CLA or DCO is required, that's been cleared by our legal. And it's also approved by the product, any product lines that might be impacted by it. We also will, make sure that they have taken a minimum amount of training. So I think, training is another one.
Yeah, I mean, we have sort of the concept of the scope of contributions defined, and if you want to go outside of that, you have to come back to extend that approval.
Yeah, that go ahead.
I'm trying to get a word in edgewise over here. You can finish that thought, but I have one thing when you're done with that.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Okay, I was going to let you finish, but that thought, and just then state my piece. Sorry.
Okay. If there's no other thoughts immediately about what the output is for a particular company, and we're going to continue to come back to this. I'm going to put together a more formal list of draft items we're talking about. We'll iterate through them and evolve them as we go. But go ahead if you want to make another point about what we're trying to do here. Go for it.
Okay, so part of the policy, I think, for most companies is going to be some kind of statement regarding IP and what's releasable or not releasable, or IP checks that would need to be done before any contribution is made.
Yeah, so some vetting or review and clearance. Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of like we're going to assume that per project. So I would say contribution, review and clearance. Review and approve. So we kind of assume that there should be some kind of minimum kind of, it's almost like you're approving it for, obviously, for several things, making sure you're complying with all the licenses that you might have incorporated in your changes, or you're not giving away company jewels. Okay. Yeah, that should. I think that's a fair position to assume that there's some level of review and clearance. Okay. Okay. Again, so you would expect, these are things that you like to make sure that exist once this program has been followed and properly executed for a given project, right? Anything else do you think that a company would like to make sure exists as the output of a successfully run community engagement initiative? Okay, so let me just leave that for the moment, and I'm going to jump over to this other output item, is the acquisition or the buyer. I think Sammy, you might have emphasized that during an M&A, this might be something that the acquirer would be interested to make sure that you're doing the right thing. You haven't given away too much. What are you thinking here?
It's about the IP exposure. So, for example, I think Mary touched on when you contribute, sort of has the IP review being conducted, and what is the scope of that IP review? You know, what's the extent of the licenses that are granted? What is, you know, are you explicit with regards to copyright, patents, etc.? Is it just you know, have you signed a CLA? Have you, you know, those are the type of things that typically get asked as part of a due diligence process.
And I would just say also a list of projects.
Around external contributions to the company.
Mm-hmm.
That's
okay.
right.
So yeah, okay. And the next one, oops, is a little harder to, I think, quantify unless different communities or projects are going to have different viewpoints here, I guess. But I'm not sure we are going to be able to successfully represent the community and what output they would like to have. I just generally think that they would like to make sure organizations are at least somewhat disciplined. They don't want to receive stuff that hasn't been properly reviewed. So I'm going to put this one here. I think most communities would like to make sure that there's a review process because they don't want to receive anything that the company would not want to give to them, right? So I think that's a valid one. Any other things do you think a community wants to make sure an organization is doing?
Typically, you'd expect that if there is an issue, the community would like to know who they're able to contact within a company to raise any issues relating to, you know, their project.
Or contact the company. So one thing they might do is maybe we'll have this requirement that you have a directory or a way of them reaching out to you to contact you for you to then follow up. Yeah.
Which is the same as what we do with the license compliance.
Yeah.
As part of the main because they, you know, if there's an issue externally, somebody knows, you know, there is either an email alias or something in a sort of making it clear and accessible as to how an organization can be contacted to raise specific issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that would probably, yeah, go ahead.
One thing I would want as a community member to see in somebody else's output is that they've done at least some kind of minimum verification of quality.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know. I'm not sure what you guys think of that, but
well, I think
or something.
Yeah, some kind of quality review, kind of some.
Yeah. You know, more so contribution review. I think of more in terms of license and other things that are around it, but the quality review is more about the content.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's definitely something I would think they would have some interest in. And the one thing I'm not sure of if any community is ever going to step forward to us and say, yeah, we want OpenChain to really do these things. So we may not support all these things if we don't have a strong, party on the other end, pushing us to do it.
Right.
But I think this is a very reasonable thing to think that they would want. Okay, I think we're near the end of the hour. I wasn't expecting to take the whole hour up, but it's fine. I think what we're going to do here is we're going to take community engagement, part of the spec, and start flushing it out as a the first prototype of an optional piece. And I think what we've done here is I really like the direction where we, Sammy recommended we start with the output. And I think that's what we've done today. We're quickly identifying what we think the output is for community engagement. When we get to security, we'll do something similar. Okay. With that, any last comments?
Yeah, Mark, sorry, just one sort of final thought on the community section. So quite often communities, they'll have a code of conduct. So some sort of degree is something that indicates that the company has reviewed the code of conduct and they're happy with it.
Okay. And, even if the community is not out there asking for that, we might put this into what happens is we'll have a set of requirements, and then we might have best practices, and this might become a best practice along with quality, for example. Okay. So again, this is a little mishmash of, prescription and, high level requirements. So we'll eventually fine tune this. All right. With that, I would say we're done with the spec part of this meeting, but I don't think there's much time left. So.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. And that was a very interesting meeting. So everyone, thanks for chiming in. And I guess that is about the end of our time. So thank you. If you need anything, please feel free to reach out to myself or Shane, and we'll be happy to help. And we'll see you again next time, I guess.
Fantastic.
Great,
Thanks very much. Okay, bye everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
Everyone, bye.